Title: The Echo of Shadows. The air in the city felt unusually heavy that evening, as if it were guarding a secret. Rain drummed against the metal roof of the old warehouse, pushed to the outskirts of downtown and long forgotten. No one knew that behind its rusted doors, a deadly story would unfold, one that would not soon be forgotten. Detective Clara Voss sat in her car, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup. Steam rose into the frosty December evening as she kept her eyes on the warehouse. Her instincts, which rarely failed her, told her this night would change everything. She was accustomed to chasing the city's shadows, but this time it felt different, more personal than she could have ever imagined. The message had come a week ago. A mysterious email with no sender, only a single word in the subject line: Echo. Below it, a photo, a place far too familiar to Clara. The warehouse was the scene of an unsolved case that had haunted her for years. It was where a woman had disappeared without a trace 3 years ago. Her name was Sophie Lenz, Clara's best friend. Clara had led the investigation back then, and the case had nearly destroyed her career. There were no clues, no witnesses, just an empty warehouse and Sophie's vanished trail. The police had quickly closed the file, but Clara had never let it go. And now, after all these years, someone seemed intent on reopening the wound. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her flashlight and service weapon. The time for waiting was over. She stepped out of the car, pulling her coat tighter against the rain, and headed toward the warehouse. The downpour soaked her shoulders, and the echo of her footsteps on the pavement sounded like an ominous prelude. The warehouse door wasn't locked. A sense of unease crawled over her, but she shoved it aside. Cautiously, she pushed the heavy metal door open, its ear-splitting screech slicing through the silence. Inside, the warehouse was dark, except for a faint light glowing in one corner. Clara drew her weapon and stepped in. "Hello." Her voice echoed through the space, but no response came. The faint light led her to a table with an old projector on it. Beside it was an envelope with her name on it. Hesitant, she opened it and pulled out a photo. It was Sophie, laughing and full of life, a snapshot from happier times. On the back, a message read, "Some echoes never fade. Are you ready to see the truth?" A click made Clara spin around. The projector whirred to life, casting a grainy film onto the wall. It was Sophie. She was standing in the warehouse right here in this very spot. Clara could feel her pulse racing, her breath catching in her throat. On the film, Sophie turned as if speaking to someone, but there was no sound. Then, abruptly, the image went dark, and the warehouse was plunged back into shadow. "Who's there?" Clara called out into the emptiness. She could feel she wasn't alone. Footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, but she saw nothing. Her flashlight pierced the darkness, illuminating only empty shelves and rusted machinery. The footsteps stopped. Then she heard it, a soft, familiar voice whispering her name. "Clara." Clara whipped around. The voice sounded like Sophie's, but that was impossible. It couldn't be. "Who are you?" she demanded, gripping her weapon tightly. "Show yourself." Silence. Only the drip of rainwater leaking through the roof. Suddenly, a loud crash behind her made Clara spin around. Before she could react, an arm wrapped around her neck and a rough voice growled in her ear. "Sometimes the past should stay buried, detective." With a desperate twist, Clara slammed her elbow back, hitting her attacker. He grunted and released her. She spun around, her weapon raised, but he had already vanished into the darkness. "Damn it!" she cursed, giving chase. But the warehouse was a maze of shadows, and the attacker seemed to know every inch of it. She followed the sound of retreating footsteps until she reached a back door. It was open, and the cold night air poured in. Outside, she found no one. But on the ground lay another photo. It showed a map of the city, with a location marked by a red X. Next to it was a handwritten note. "The truth begins here." Clara's hands trembled as she studied the photo. The marked location was an abandoned subway tunnel that had been closed for years. She knew she had no choice. The shadow that had attacked her in the warehouse was only the beginning. Someone was playing a dangerous game with her, and she had to find out why, and who was behind it. Clara held the photo in trembling hands, feeling the rain mix with the sweat on her skin. She pulled out her phone to call for backup, but there was no signal. The warehouse was isolated enough that she couldn't count on quick help, and, truthfully, she wasn't sure she wanted it. This case had been her personal nightmare for so long that she feared a team might drag it back into bureaucratic limbo. "I have to do this alone," she murmured to herself, recalling the map of the abandoned subway tunnel in her mind. The site had been decommissioned years ago after a cave-in rendered it unusable. Only a madman would go down there, or someone who knew the truth. The city streets were silent as Clara drove to the marked location. Her thoughts raced. Could Sophie still be alive? The voice in the warehouse, it couldn't have been her. Could it? If not, who had called out to her? When Clara reached the abandoned subway shaft, she stopped in front of a crumbling old station. The entrance gates were secured with heavy chains, but someone had recently broken them open. A cold draft swept toward her, and the faint hum of the city seemed to vanish in this desolate place. Clara switched on her flashlight and stepped inside. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the damp smell of concrete filled the air. Her footsteps echoed on the tiled floor as she descended the stairs into the depths. At the bottom, she found herself in a labyrinth of disused tunnels. The red dot on the map had been imprecise, and she would have to feel her way through the darkness. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound, a tapping. It was rhythmic, like a code, reverberating through the empty tunnels. Clara froze and listened. It came from her right. She drew her gun and followed the sound, step by cautious step. After several minutes, she came to a massive steel door. It was sealed with a strange, rusted mechanism. In the center of the door was a small slot, as if a puzzle piece had been removed. Beside the door lay another photo, this time Sophie's face, contorted in fear. Beneath it were the words, "Do you want to save her? Find the key." Clara felt a surge of anger and desperation. Someone was toying with her, and she hated it. But if there was even the slightest chance Sophie was alive, she would do whatever it took. The search for the key. The tunnels stretched out in every direction, and Clara knew the odds of finding the key by chance were slim. But the rhythmic tapping continued. It seemed to guide her. She followed the sound until she entered a larger chamber. It was an old maintenance room, filled with switches and circuits that hinted at a bygone era. In the center of the room, a single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering weakly. On an old metal table lay an object that caught Clara's attention immediately. A small, oddly shaped key made of bronze. "That was too easy," she muttered, her weapon in one hand and flashlight in the other. She stepped forward cautiously, but before she could reach the key, she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, aiming her gun into the darkness. "Who's there? Show yourself," she called. Silence. Then a sound, a faint laugh, and a voice. "You're brave, detective, or just foolish. Did you really think it would be that simple?" The voice was distorted, as if coming through a speaker. Clara scanned the room, searching for its source. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" "The truth," the voice replied. "But are you ready to hear it?" Clara ignored the taunt and reached for the key. At that moment, something exploded behind her. A blinding flash and deafening bang knocked her to the ground. Smoke filled the air, and Clara felt a sharp pain in her shoulder where a fragment had struck her. "Damn it!" she hissed, struggling to her knees. The key was gone, and the room was plunged into complete darkness. She couldn't see, couldn't hear, save for the ringing in her ears. Then she felt it, a hand on her shoulder. Clara spun around, her weapon ready, but there was no one there. Only another message, projected onto the wall in glaring red letters, "Follow the echo." Clara knew she had no choice. She had to press on, deeper into the labyrinth, to uncover who had drawn her into this twisted game, and whether Sophie was truly still alive. The path grew darker, the air heavier, and the shadows around her seemed to move. What Clara didn't know was that the true enemy awaited her at the tunnel's end, and the truth she sought was far more horrifying than she could have ever imagined. The darkness seemed to pulse as Clara ventured deeper into the abandoned tunnels. Each step felt like another descent into hell. The uneven path ahead was treacherous, and the echo of her footsteps mocked her, as if the emptiness around her was laughing. Her flashlight cast weak beams of light on the walls, stained with rust and mold. The message, "Follow the echo," burned in her mind, and the relentless tapping continued to guide her. Clara's thoughts raced. Whoever orchestrated this twisted game knew far too much. About her, about Sophie, about everything. Was this a personal vendetta, or was it part of something larger, darker, that she had yet to comprehend? But the most pressing question was, why now? After another turn, Clara entered an open chamber suffused with a faint, greenish glow. Old neon tubes hung from the walls, flickering as if in their final moments. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it lay another photograph. Clara's stomach tightened as she approached and examined the image. It was a picture of herself. It showed her standing in the warehouse, gun drawn, just hours earlier. But the photograph looked old, as if it had been stored in some archive for years. On the back was a message. "Do you see it now? Time is a lie." Clara stared at the photo, her heart pounding. The words made no sense, yet she felt they carried a deeper meaning, one she couldn't yet grasp. She was just about to slip the photo into her pocket when she heard a sound, a faint, uneven breathing. Spinning around, she aimed her weapon at the source. In the corner of the room, half hidden by shadows, sat a figure. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothing, with sunken cheeks and eyes flickering with fear and madness. Clara kept her weapon trained on him as she stepped closer, speaking calmly. "Don't move. Who are you? What are you doing here?" The man raised his hands slowly, his gaze darting between Clara and the door behind her. "You're real?" he whispered, as though he hadn't spoken in years. "Or are you part of it too?" "Part of what?" Clara held her position, her finger tight on the trigger. "Answer me. How did you get here?" The man chuckled, a high-pitched, deranged laugh that echoed through the room. "There's no escape," he murmured. "We're all just echoes. Everything we do has already been done. You don't understand yet, but you will." "Listen to me," Clara said sharply, though she could see the man teetering on the edge of sanity. "I need to know who you are and why you're here." He shook his head, his laughter growing more unhinged. "The shadow, it watches us. It hears everything. Do you think you can stop it? It is time. It is the darkness." Suddenly he sprang to his feet and charged at Clara. She instinctively stepped back, shouting, "Stop right there!" But he didn't. His movements were erratic, like those of a wild animal. Clara fired a warning shot into the air, but he didn't stop. With a swift sidestep, she let him stumble past her. He collapsed to the ground, trembling. Clara cautiously approached, but before she could speak again, he whispered something that made her blood run cold. "The key is in your heart." Then he slumped over, motionless. Clara checked his pulse. He was dead. She stepped back, her breathing heavy. His final words echoed in her mind. "The key is in your heart." What did it mean? Was it a metaphor? Or had he hidden something inside her, somehow? A sudden icy sensation washed over her. Clara felt eyes on her. She swung her flashlight around the room but saw no one. Her instincts screamed that she was in danger. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and forced herself to stay focused. The echo of the shadow deepens. Clara decided she couldn't waste any more time. She had to figure out what the man's words meant before she succumbed to the same madness. She stepped out of the chamber, following the tunnels further, the echo of her footsteps now accompanied by a faint whisper. It felt like a presence she couldn't shake. Soon, she reached a fork in the path where an old sign pointed downward. Maintenance Area C, access prohibited. The whispers grew louder, as though urging her to go that way. Clara hesitated only a moment before taking the forbidden path. The air grew colder, and the darkness around her felt almost tangible. But in the distance, she saw a faint light. It was golden and flickered like an old gas lantern. Clara approached it, gripping her weapon and flashlight tightly. When she reached the light, she saw it came from an ancient lantern resting on a pedestal. Beside it was a metal box secured with a lock. An engraved symbol, a spiral, adorned the lid. It reminded her of the projection she'd seen in the warehouse. Kneeling, Clara examined the box. "The key," she murmured, reaching for the chain around her neck. Hanging from it was a pendant Sophie had given her years ago, a small bronze spiral. She had always seen it as a symbol of their friendship, but now she wondered if it meant something more. She inserted the pendant into the lock. With a soft click, it opened. Clara stared at the open metal box, her pulse quickening. She had expected something mystical or sinister inside, but its contents surprised her. an old tape recorder and a crumpled file held together by a rubber band. The file bore no official seal, but the handwriting on the cover was sharp and precise. Operation Echo, confidential. Clara sat on the cold concrete floor, hesitating only briefly before pressing play on the tape recorder. A smoky male voice filled the room, as though speaking to her from another time. Report Operation Echo, Day 432. Test Subject 7 continues to exhibit signs of cognitive instability. The effects of isolation and manipulated sensory input are stronger than anticipated. We're on the brink of breaking through, but the moral implications are troubling. The death of Subject 5 has already raised questions. Should we proceed? This will be my final recording before I put an end to it all. Sophie, forgive me. Clara's hands trembled as she turned off the device. The name Sophie made her thoughts race. Was her friend part of this project? And what in the world was Operation Echo? Turning to the file, she untied the rubber band and began to read. The file contained reports of a secret government project that had begun over a decade ago. Its goal was to push the limits of human perception through extreme isolation, psychological manipulation, and advanced technology. The documents suggested that participants were deliberately trapped in a kind of hallucination loop to determine how far the human mind could be fractured before it completely broke. The final page listed a roster of names. Clara froze when she saw the third entry. Lenz Sophie. Status, missing. A chill ran down Clara's spine. Sophie hadn't disappeared by chance. She had been part of an experiment, and someone had been waiting all these years to draw Clara here and reveal the truth. An uninvited guest. Before Clara could process what she'd read, she heard footsteps, heavy and slow, echoing down the tunnel. Hastily, she snapped the file shut, stuffed it into her jacket pocket, and gripped her gun. Her flashlight illuminated the room's entrance, but no one was there. Who's there? She called out, her voice steady despite the tension building inside her. There was no response. The footsteps grew louder and then abruptly stopped. Clara aimed her weapon at the tunnel, her breathing shallow, the silence pressing in on her like a weight. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, perhaps in his 50s, with gray hair and a face marked by exhaustion and calculation. His clothes were plain but clean, and he held a lantern in one hand. "You've come farther than I expected," he said, his voice one Clara immediately recognized from the recording. "Who are you?" she demanded, keeping her gun trained on him. "I'm the one who tried to stop this," he said, lifting the lantern slightly, a gesture of peace. "But it was too late, and now you're here because they chose you." "What do you mean? Who chose me, and what does this have to do with Sophie?" The man sighed heavily, as though her questions were no surprise. "You already know, deep down. Sophie was part of the experiment. She came here willingly, at first, but she uncovered something she wasn't supposed to see, and I was too much of a coward to save her." Clara felt anger welling up inside her. "That's not enough. You owe me more than cryptic answers. What happened to Sophie? Where is she?" The man met Clara's gaze, and in his eyes she saw something she couldn't quite decipher. Regret, perhaps even fear. "I can't tell you everything, but if you want answers, you'll have to go to the deepest point. That's where the truth lies, and it will destroy you if you're not strong enough." The descent into darkness. Clara knew she had no other choice. The man led her in silence deeper into the tunnel system, until they reached a massive ancient shaft. A rusty metal ladder descended into a darkness so profound that even her flashlight couldn't penetrate it. "She's down there," the man said quietly. "But I warn you, it's not what you're expecting." "I don't need warnings," Clara replied, gripping the ladder and beginning her descent. The climb down felt endless. The air grew heavier and the temperature dropped the further she went. Finally, she reached the bottom, a vast underground chamber, bathed in faint, flickering light. In the center of the chamber stood a strange device, a blend of an old-fashioned typewriter and a modern computer. On the screen, a single sentence flickered. "Welcome, Clara. The truth awaits." Behind her, Clara heard a sound. She spun around and froze. Sophie was standing there. But she wasn't the Sophie Clara knew. Her face was pale, her eyes vacant, and her movements were mechanical, as if controlled by some external force. "Sophie?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling with pain. Sophie looked at her, unblinking. Then, in a voice that wasn't her own, she said, "It's time, Clara. Time to become part of the Echo." Clara's heart raced as she looked at Sophie, or what was left of her. The woman standing before her bore little resemblance to the vibrant, courageous friend she once knew. Her movements were unnaturally fluid, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. But it wasn't just the coldness in Sophie's voice that alarmed Clara. It was the expression in her eyes, a hollow, soulless void. "Sophie, it's me. Clara," she said slowly, her voice trembling but clear. She lowered her weapon slightly, hoping that some part of her old friend remained. "You can hear me, right? I'll get you out of here, I promise." Sophie tilted her head slightly, as if processing the words. But then her face twisted into a foreign, almost mocking grin. "Clara, Clara, always the savior, aren't you? But there's nothing to save. It's already over. We're all part of it now." Clara instinctively stepped back, tightening her grip on her weapon. "What are you talking about? Part of what? Tell me what's going on." Sophie's grin faded, and for a brief moment, something real flickered in her eyes, something filled with pain. "It never stopped," she whispered. "It was never just an experiment. They used us, Clara. They used me. And now it's your turn." Before Clara could react, Sophie lunged forward, faster than Clara expected. Instinctively, Clara pulled the trigger, and the shot echoed deafeningly through the chamber. Sophie collapsed to the ground, but the sound of the gunfire didn't fade. It lingered unnaturally, merging with another noise, a deep, resonant hum that made the floor vibrate beneath Clara's feet. The truth below. Clara stood trembling, her weapon still aimed at the spot where Sophie had fallen. But as the smoke cleared, there was nothing there. No body, no blood, just the flickering screen of the strange device in the center of the room. The sentence on it had changed. "Why do you hesitate, Clara? Come closer." Her throat felt dry. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but something held her back. It wasn't just curiosity or the desire to save Sophie, it was the sense that she had come too far to turn back. She had to find the truth, no matter the cost. Slowly, she stepped closer to the device. She could hear the hum emanating from it, a low, hypnotic sound that resonated in her ears. As she stood before it, the screen flickered again. A new message appeared. "Sit. Write." Clara swallowed hard. "What am I supposed to write?" she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. But the machine responded as if it had heard her. "The truth. It all begins with you." The words sent a chill through her. It felt as though something was watching her, not just from the darkness around her, but from within her. Reluctantly, she sat on the rickety metal chair in front of the device. Her fingers trembled as they touched the keys. At first, she didn't know what to type. But then it began to flow on its own. Her fingers moved as if guided by an unseen force, typing things she didn't understand. These weren't memories, but fragments of conversations, images, and cryptic instructions. She kept typing, trapped in a trance-like focus as the hum grew louder around her. The echo of the past. Clara didn't know how much time had passed when she finally looked up. Her hands ached, and her eyes burned from the screen's harsh light. The text she had written was long and disjointed, a mix of personal memories and alien phrases that made no sense. But amidst the chaos, one word kept repeating: beginning. Before she could make sense of it, the screen flickered again. A video began to play. The footage was old, grainy, and distorted, but Clara recognized the person immediately. Sophie. She was sitting in what looked like a sterile lab cell, but speaking directly to the camera. "If you're watching this, Clara, then you've come. They've pulled you in, just like they did with me. You have to know I tried to protect you, but I couldn't escape. No one can. This isn't an experiment anymore. It's something bigger. It's alive. And now it's alive in you too." Sophie paused, tears streaming down her face. "It will make you see things, do things that aren't real. But you can't believe it. You have to stay strong, and you have to end it. There's only one way." The video cut off, and the screen went black. For a moment there was silence, but then the hum returned, louder and more intense. The darkness around Clara seemed to shift, to breathe. She jumped to her feet, gripping her weapon tightly, but she knew she was facing something far beyond her control. The final step. The walls of the chamber began to vibrate, and a new message appeared on the screen. End it, or it will consume you. Clara didn't know what it was, but she could feel her time running out. She pulled the file from her pocket, flipping through the pages desperately for a clue. Finally, she found a drawing of the device with a simple instruction beneath it. Cut the power. Destroy all data. A loud crash startled her. Pieces of the ceiling fell, and a dark, amorphous mass began to seep from the shadows. It wasn't a creature. It was like living darkness, reaching for her. Clara ran. She searched frantically for the power source, and finally found a panel on the wall. With one last glance back, she yanked the cables free. The hum stopped, and the device powered down. The darkness screamed. It wasn't a sound that could be heard with human ears. It was a searing pain that nearly brought Clara to her knees. But then, it was gone. When she looked around, the chamber was empty. The device was gone. The darkness and Sophie had vanished. Clara knew she hadn't won. She had only survived. But the truth she had uncovered would haunt her forever.